Japan, if you count services as well, it's closer to 100, so Japan is bigger than I was giving them credit for. But Korea is a large market, and I think in terms of regional policies, if we're going to have an Asian strategy, ultimately we have to engage directly with China and Japan and India, as well as with Korea and ASEAN. But it will be very valuable for the administration to come to an Asian strategy, having said, okay, we have Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, deals with Australia, with Singapore, maybe can broaden out to some of the larger ASEAN members. And we have a record of taking on agreement with a large partner and getting it done, in the case of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. That will, I think, have some regional political benefit and add to the credibility of the U.S. administration. It will also get us involved in some complex and more long-term issues that the U.S. will really need to grapple with in trade policy generally as time passes. We have a lot of country-to-country trade with Korea, but we also have very deep and involved services trade relationships in finance, telecom, entertainment. Certain instances illustrated in Korea, and published in Los Angeles. Very deep and involved research collaborations. So the agreement with Korea does have a chance to be something we can draw on in our relationships with very large developed economies, European Union, Japan, and so on. So I think as the administration is mulling over trade strategy, we'll need to think, I think in broader terms, more multilateral terms, more sectoral terms than we've been doing in the past decade. But we also need to take the agenda it's inherited, and I think in particular the KORUS, and show the world we can get these things done. We can work through difficult questions over the auto trade, over the beef trade, those sorts of topics, and get them through Congress. What are the prospects for 2010? Well, it's kind of hard to say. I think the governments have been consulting with one another. The two presidents have said they want to get this done. Those are the preconditions for finishing something. I'm not aware that the problem areas have advanced very much, and I think they'll have to begin advancing pretty soon if the administration is going to be able to do all of its notifications to Congress and meet all the timetables that I think it wants to meet. But I think it's an important task for the administration on one hand for dealing with an important alliance relationship in Asia, another way for providing some export impact in a year when we need it pretty badly, and for setting the foundation for a broader trade policy that after 4 years will allow us to say that in this period of crisis, when the U.S., I think, needs export-led growth more than we have in many, many years, trade policy was able to provide that. So let me close it there. I think my partner and friend Steve will talk more about the relationship with Korea in detail. And after that, we can open up to questions. And once again, thanks to Troy and KEI for inviting me today.
Thank you. I think that was a great overview of some of these issues, and I'll try to go quickly. And I apologize for putting the PowerPoint on you, but it's sometimes useful to show some of these things graphically. And as Troy mentioned, I kind of come out with a background. It's going to be the first boots on the ground with Bob Luther, and also doing some of the crime and terrorism stuff with G8. So look at some more of the strategic issues overall. As Troy mentioned, in 2009, the alliance faced a financial tsunami that we hadn't seen in most of a generation. Now we're seeing signs of growth after massive fiscal stimulus policies, where I think there's a chance of the alliance to lead. I mean, the tsunami we went through really could have upended relationships, made things more important. But if you look at a range of factors, it's made the U.S.-Korea alliance at the center of these issues in a way they really haven't been in almost a half century. If you look at the G8, which I can say is the former head of the G8's crime and terrorism efforts during the last U.S. presidency, may need to change dramatically if it's going to have some real impact as the G20. So will it be a turning point or business as usual as recovery settles in? I think KORUS is really the key test, because I think if you look at what's going to happen, as we'll talk more in depth, at the G20, also at the APEC meeting in Japan, it again is going to put a spotlight on whether the U.S. really has a trade policy in Asia, while many countries are moving forward. Again, this is we talked for a long time about a 21st century alliance. I think working on these is a great opportunity to do so. And I think it will also have much broader global and regional ramifications, again, for trade policy, for security policy, in one of the most important regions in the world. Like Ed, I think it's important to kind of look at the perspective of where we've come from. And over the last year, it looked like we were going over the cliff, the downsides of Friedman's desire. Now we're seeing signs of recovery. I think there's new changes in terms of interconnections and speed we're dealing with. And our institutions, whether it's the WTO or others, have really not caught up with that. Mixed lessons. We've learned a lot of the lessons about the Great Depression in terms of fiscal and monetary policy. I think the bigger questions are going to be, especially if we're in an anemic growth period, does this translate into populism and longer-term protectionism, and how are we going to deal with those new institutions that we have? And I think, even though we've avoided the worst of it, we're still in a state of flux and decisions matter. And we're going to have to see where this goes. And a lot of talk at the beginning of this, is this the end of capitalism? And when we went down, it certainly felt like it might be that way. But to Ed's point, if you look at the correlation, and obviously correlation is not causation, but opening trade and world GDP, over the last 50 years, we've seen the most phenomenal rise in living standards in history. And a lot of that has been due to trade policy and opening markets in some detail. Response, there used to be a bumper sticker that said, think globally, act globally. I think the G20 largely has been talk globally, act nationally. There's been a lot of great ambitions and targets. It's kind of somewhat like the Annapolis Peace Conference, where they say they want Middle East peace or they want new bank regulations, but getting there is really tough, especially with a lot of different interests. And I know from experience in the G8, it's very tough to get there. So it's not, without understanding of how hard it is. Politics may be constraining action in Europe and Asia. Chinese currency issues, Asian, German export economies, where they're really going to readjust and how. How much U.S. political capital will be directed in healthcare, climate change, rather than these issues. And key questions, will these institutions really reform now that the crisis is over and we're seeing a real impact? I think Korea, as a country that has gone remarkably from a developing country to one of the most advanced growing economies, has a critical role to play along with the United States next year. So that's the real question. And again, are we going to be stuck at lowest common denominator or dynamic multilateralism? This is something I think Ed talked about finding new ways forward in trade policy and a number of different issues where we're just stuck. Whether it's the WTO, trade policy, services, proliferation. You may need to form smaller groups of more like-minded states or across different issues. You may need to follow up to all the statements that are made at G20 and are never actually followed up on. And we may need to think about involving non-governmental organizations, businesses, others that are key players along with the nation state in the future. But that's not really the focus here. Korea and the United States, Korea has done quite well after the crisis. The United States, a little bit less so. Again, we've avoided falling off the cliff. Unemployment's at 20-year highs. Exports have still not rebounded that quickly. And when you look at growth projections for regions from the IMF, developing Asia, emerging Asia lead the pack. China, obviously, with its own massive stimulus, particularly proportional to the size of its economy. India, Korea doing quite well, but then you've got U.S. major economies, the EU not doing so great. And overall, world growth of about 3% is still fairly stagnant in terms of creating jobs in the world. So the big question, and Mohammed Ali calls the new normal. I'm not really sure how normal it's going to be for any period of time. So what we kind of call the next global economy, and I think Ed touched on this too, which I think is the trillion-dollar question. U.S. consumers are new debt spending. 70% of our economy, shifted somewhat, but we're still, I think, over 110% of discretionary income. That may just cause more problems. Exports, to whom everyone wants to build an export strategy at the same time in a globally synchronized downturn. How is that going to play out? New market openings, removable barriers. Previously at the end of the Cold War,